slideshow. Hopefully everyone can see this. And again, I've got David Shrigley's art. So, well, to maybe get a handle on where Marx was coming from, in his day and in ours, we're dealing with oligarchy, which is means technically rule of the few, but it has also come to mean rule of the wealthy. So like Russia is basically an oligarchic state. It's run by a few billionaires and Putin is one of them. The United States is also more or less an oligarchic state where a few billionaires have outrageous amounts of political power and the rest of the population has almost none. And the quotes over here on the right are from a study of politics that show that the business interests have a substantial independent impact on US government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. So it's not just a suspicion, it's actually true. All right, and I am gonna also wear a meritocracy. Yeah, we can all be billionaires, right. So yeah, and also I think I mentioned in class one time the class, what is called class fluidity or something. Anyway, your ability to move up in class in the United States is actually, most people way overestimate what it is. Class mobility, that's it. It's actually around 10 to 13%. And for some groups in the US, it's much smaller. And we tend to be on the low end of that compared to other modern industrialized societies. So, all right. Also, Marx was focused primarily on dealing with this issue of exploitation as a sort of moral, moral imperative to do something about it. And, I picked one quote here from a billionaire in the 1800s who said he could hire one half of the working class to kill the other half. And that's fairly true. I mean, partly what we're talking about today is how, in terms of like the poor or working people, that out of desperation or for other reasons, they can often be enlisted to work against their own interests or the interests of fellow workers, fellow poor people. Same thing's true when we talk about feminism, that many women can be caught up in doing the worst kinds of enforcement of patriarchal values in the society, putting down other women and themselves and so on, or climbing on top of other women to get, rise up in the patriarchal system. So it does turn people against each other. Yes, and it's certainly harder to move up than down, but the systems, as they are systems of power, turn us against one another rather than towards one another. Marx, the name Marx often brings up images of violent revolution and dictatorships, but in academia, when we're talking about Marxist theory, specifically in relationship to literature and the humanities, we're not usually talking about political systems as much as we're thinking about Marx as a theorist. So he wrote many books of theory, and they address economics, history, sociology, politics, and consciousness. And I think it is somewhat possible to divorce his theory from the 19th century from political movements and events of the 20th century. Certainly, he had nothing to do with the 20th century events other than people used his name and his writings to justify this or that. It is fair to say, I think, that he, along with Freud and Darwin, are considered the most significant figures of the 19th and early 20th century in terms of shaping our understanding of the world. And that also it's fair to keep in mind that Marxist traditions of theory, critique, and politics, they have undergone major shifts and permutations since his death in 1883. Dialogue and debate among Marxist theorists is alive and well inside and outside academics. So, yeah, and I'm reading a book right now called Marxism After Marx, which takes us through, a variety of theorists who followed Marx. Some of them more right than others. So, like I tend to respect the work of Althusser a lot. There's quite a few Marxist theorists, Balabar, Mascheret, many. We'll encounter some of their names today, who I think have done really critical work, and they have tools that Marx didn't have in his time, just as Freud did a lot of work where he didn't really have the tools. People came later. Okay. Materialism is a key term in Marx. It does not refer to commodity fetishism, which is when people are obsessed with showing off their worldly goods. It basically means looking at the world and trying to understand the situation we're in as being based on material causes. So basically says, don't look for metaphysical causes or spiritual causes to explain reality. If we're in a bad way, it's not because God has, put a curse on us, or if we're in a good way, it's not because we're blessed. It's because there are material forces that can explain our situation, or at least better than these other explanations. And so Marxism tends to be based on these material explanations. Expropriation is another key term here. And basically it means, forcible seizure. So at the beginning of kind of the modern capitalist period, which we might trace to, I forget when they look at it, 1700s, basically some wealthy people organized some soldiers to go onto peasant land and just seize it and put a fence around it and post guards on it and tell the peasants they couldn't use that land anymore. And then they would call that a private estate. So that's an example of expropriation or personal or forcible seizure. And Marx basically said at some point the workers are going to realize there is more of them and they can forcibly seize back the wealth of the rulers. So capitalism didn't get started because of meritocracy. It got started because of expropriation. Like, for example, we talk about Ireland being poor and Ireland having these famines and some things like that. Well, the reason for that was British wealthy people in Britain seized and occupied 90 to 95% of the land in Ireland. There was just nothing left for the people who lived there. So it wasn't that the Irish were, incapable of taking care of themselves. It's just that all of their wealth was seized from them. So, class structure. I put these terms in our module, but basically we sort of need to understand how class is constructed. And in the capitalist era, we have bourgeoisie. They're the owners of the means of production. And in particular, it means that they're also, the difference between bourgeoisie and capitalists, there's a slight difference there. A capitalist is someone who is able to make their living solely from capital that they've invested. In other words, let's say they've invested their wealth and they can live off the residual of that, which is, interest, dividends, things like that. So capitalists may or may not be bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie may or may not be capitalists, but definitely the top of the bourgeoisie are, which means they don't have to work. They could live purely on the growth of the capital that they have invested. The means of production means that they are owning, generally speaking, in Marx's time, he was talking about factories. But we can refer to things beyond factories as just any wealth-making operation, whether it's the media, or it could be a sports team, it could be anything that generates wealth. And the owners get wealthy by, to some extent, exploiting the workers who work for them, which means taking surplus labor from the workers. So the petit bourgeois, not to be confused with the bourgeoisie, are small business owners, bakers, plumbers, etc. These are people who have to work. They might own productive property, but they can't just live off the residuals of it. They have to actually work on it. What Marx noted in his time was that these people tended to identify more with the bourgeoisie and fight for the bourgeoisie rather than for other workers. And you still see that today in the sense of, tremendous anti-union sentiment among the petit bourgeoisie, tremendous amounts of racism, and also lots of identification with wealthier people as though they're going to somehow be wealthy one day, when the fact is, the vast majority of them will continue to be working at their enterprise for their entire lives, at least until they retire. The intelligentsia, which includes me, and also, people who work in the media, and many of them become managers and so on also. These are members of capitalist society who produce knowledge and knowledge management. And as capitalism developed, it required more and more knowledge all the time because production got more sophisticated and complicated. But also because, in addition to the management of the production process, there was the social management, right? So you have to manage the whole society because basically you've manipulated the whole society to produce wealth for you. So you have to continue to manipulate them in ways that they don't figure it out or start a revolution or something like that. So the intelligentsia is basically set up to protect the wealth of the wealthy, and to enact policies that are against the interests of everybody else. Now, a few of these intelligentsia, being generally smart and maybe having some morality, may not like the system that they're in very much and might protest or lead counter movements against the wealthy. So the managerial class are basically the mid-level workers who run the day-to-day operations of major institutions. And often we think of these people as bosses, but they have bosses above them, and so it's really the owners who are in control, and the managerial class serve at their pleasure and can be fired for not properly serving their interests. So they're separate. They don't necessarily have capital. Some bourgeoisie are also managers, and like Jeff Bezos is also a CEO, right? But he's also a bourgeoisie. He doesn't have to work again a day in his life if he doesn't want to. The aristocracy. Now, this is like the previous system. So what Marx was really interested in, this transition from aristocratic wealth to capitalist wealth production. So the aristocracy were the noble classes, kings and queens, etc., who owned land. And the American South, the economic system in the South, was primarily set up based on that system. It tended to be more agricultural and less sort of factory oriented. But the peasantry were the people who lived on the land belonging to the aristocracy. So In Europe, the way peasantry worked was the landowner, who was usually some kind of noble, would lend workers their own piece of land, maybe a house, maybe some tools or something. And in exchange, the peasantry would work on the owner's private land and give him all of the material that was generated from that. So like the worker, the peasant, would get to keep the whatever they put into their own land that was loaned to them. And then, like, say you work 80 hours a week, you could work maybe 60-40 or whatever the rule was, 70-30, some on your land, some on their land. And at that time, it was very, very clear that whenever you worked on the owner's land, that was for him and that was for his money, and you didn't get any of that. The same thing under capitalism is that, let's say you work 40 hours a week. Well, 20 hours of that you work for you and you keep the money, and 20 hours of that you work for the owner and they keep the money, except you don't know exactly when that line is crossed. You don't know if it's 20 hours, 30 hours or whatever, but at a certain point that line is crossed and the rest of the money goes not to you, but to him. So it's more obscured about how the money is divided up. Marx spends a lot of time writing about value. Oh, have I seen Squid Games? Not yet, no. That's yes, I'd like to. Yeah. So value means lots of different things, and what Marx is talking about here are the different kinds of value within capitalism. So first, this is from David Smith's book, Introducing Marxism. He says there's abstract labor, which appears in a variety of forms. So in Marx's argument is we have natural resources, and then to turn those natural resources into wealth or value or commodities, there has to be some labor that goes into it, whether it's just picking up the thing, like picking apples. There's still some labor involved. And then that labor appears in three forms. It can appear in a commodity, which is the thing you buy at the store. The commodity can be transferred into money, or it can be in capital. Okay, so normally with money, like if you're not a capitalist, what you do with your money is you spend it and you get things for it, which could be goods or services. If you're a capitalist, most of your money doesn't go into spending and buying things. It goes into owning things or into investment. So investment is wealth that produces more wealth. Most of us don't have, at least not the majority of our wealth, in areas that produce more wealth. We just spend it to survive. Use value is the non-exchanged usefulness of any given object. So, I need a shovel so I can move some dirt from here to there. That the use value of the shovel is its ability, my ability to use it to move that dirt. Exchange value is how much that shovel costs, so $25 at Ace Hardware or whatever. Labor value is the amount of labor necessary to make a thing. So let's say it took, a total of 2 hours to make that shovel. So that's the labor value that went into it. Fetish value is the ability to impress. So if I showed off my shovel and someone else was impressed, then it might have an additional value. Maybe I buy a really expensive shovel because I want to be seen as, I don't know what, a shovel show off. So again, that's sort of like what we talked about last week with the diamond necklace, that the power of the diamond necklace was its fetish value, essentially its display value. It had commodity fetish value. It got that from its ability to impress other people, which is unrelated to its exchange value because it could be fake, right? The idea is that to have that necklace, you would have to spend an enormous amount of money, but in fact, you can fake it. And the same is true today. You can get knockoff brands that look like the real brands for a fraction of the price, and then you can have the ability to impress, right? Surplus value is the profit which results from the unpaid labor. So let's say I buy 25, the shovel is $25. The labor value that went into it, they were paid $20, the laborers, and then the rest of the $5 went to the owners. So that would be surplus value, which was extracted from the workers because maybe they should have gotten all $25, right? All right, alienation is another key term in Marxism, where he points to a lot of things as being the source of our alienation, but he claims that alienation is increased over time, so that particularly under factory conditions, like let's say in older conditions, if you were petty bourgeois, let's say you were a shoemaker, right? You produce a shoe or a pair of shoes from beginning to end. Maybe you buy the leather or the whatever, the soles, but you produce the shoe from beginning to end, and then you own the shoe until you sell it. So you're not alienated from your labor because you see the whole process from beginning to end, and you're not alienated from the product because you own the product when it's done. If you work in a factory, you're alienated from the product. Let's say you're making cars, you don't own the car when that process is done, and you have no control over the whole process. You just do one thing, which is maybe, install a window. So you're alienated from the process and from the product. You're also alienated from your fellow workers who you see as competitors in a system with you rather than, your compatriots. You're alienated from your time, which you've sold to other people, and from our bodies, which are being used for labor, which we have to ignore to a certain extent in order to fulfill the labor demands, and from our minds, which require us to contradict our own desires in order to fulfill our work in this capitalist system. There's a great deal of commentary on alienation in terms of the worker in terms of comparing it to prostitution. That basically it was the same as prostitution, but it just wasn't necessarily sexual. That someone else owned your time, owned your body, owned your mind, and told you what to do and controlled you and alienated you from life processes for however long you were doing it, right? So basically, that's the argument, we're all prostitutes, even if we're not necessarily sexually engaged in selling ourselves. So to overcome the feelings of alienation, we turn to fetishism by imbuing commodities with mystical powers. So commodities then have this sort of compensatory feature, which is psychologically, they seem to give us back what was taken from us. So in exchange for giving up my self-control for this capitalist system, I get to take some enjoyment in owning a fancy new toaster or, a great car or whatever it is, fancy clothes. And I imbue those with mystical powers. In other words, they make me special in some way. I'm a special person because I own these things, and everybody else sees me as special because they know I'm different because I drive this, or I make my toast in that, right? We also tend to see other people as means to our own ends, to our personal satisfaction, which can maybe explain why there's so much abuse in workplaces from customers, right? Like flight attendants are getting punched, people are insulting to clerks, they're mean to their waiters and waitresses, and they're just like, we seek to use people for our own satisfaction because that's the status quo. That's what we see happening in the system. So we reproduce that. But exploiting others and participating in commodity fetishism only deepens our alienation. Okay. Marx's prophecy failed. I think that's pretty clear. He argued that under a capitalist system, the workers would be organized by the capitalists to be working together and would come to see their own interests as apart from that of the owners, and realize that they had the power to stop contributing to the owner's wealth and to, in fact, take over the means of production themselves. This has happened sporadically in history in a few places, in sometimes with longer term success than others. But generally it failed. And so part of the argument here is that the Marxists have made since the time of Marx is to try to explain why it's failed or why it hasn't succeeded yet, one of those two things. So I would say Marx underestimated, should be a D, the power of capitalism to adapt, right? Capitalists to learn from situations where it looked like they were close to losing their power or close to revolution. And also he underestimated the power of ideology and propaganda to enlist the working class in working for their own exploitation and destruction. So he didn't quite see in his own time, and he had lived through some revolutions. There was the Paris uprising, there was a revolution in Germany at one point. They were crushed militarily, but not in these other ways, right? So he thought, well, if it's just a question of military success, then it's inevitable. There's a matter of time where, the military forces of the rulers will lose. But it wasn't just a military question. There are these other factors. So here I'm jumping ahead 100 years to Althusser. Mentioned this in our module, but Althusser, I think, was trying to explain why Marx's prophecy failed and to try and understand it in terms of ideology. So what he noted was that there were two kinds of powers that the state had. One were what he called repressive state apparatus powers, or RSAs. And those are usually state entities that have the power to use violence. So the army, police, courts, and prisons are all examples of RSAs. They can kill you, lock you up, expel you from the country, whatever. ISAs are sort of more like soft power. These are institutions that aren't authorized to use force, but work ideologically to convert people to the capitalist system, or to keep them within it, or to exert pressure on them not to rebel, and so on. And these are institutions like family, church, politics, education, trade unions, mass media, and cultural institutions, such as sports and literature. Now, every once in a while, these ISAs may be in conflict with the state or in conflict with the RSAs. But they can be brought into line usually. There's different methods for bringing them into line, which is, education is acting up. They're saying, educators are saying they don't like the exploitation that's going on. Well, we'll cut their funding. We'll punish particular ones to make an example of them. We'll ban the readings that they're doing. We see this happening today all over the place. Like, people in education are kind of fed up with the misery and are trying to do something about it. And so the response is punish education. But generally speaking, these apparatuses align with the state, not oppose the state. So the state supports the ideological state apparatuses that support it, and it represses those that do not. So here's some questions. A question for you that I'm also going to attempt to answer here, which is, why do we tend to feel free, though we're constrained by our identities within a system of ideological categories? And again, going back to the previous page, just briefly, I would say, we are always members of some apparatus, whether it's an RSA or an ISA. You might be a soldier in the army, or police officer, or working in the court or prison. But even if you're not, you're in a family, maybe belong to a church, participate in a political party, play some role in education, like being a student. Maybe you're a union member or you consume mass media or whatever. So we're all involved in these apparatuses. We all have identities within them. And what makes us feel free when we're actually largely those institutions sort of entrap us or police us in terms of our behavior? And the answer is that Althusser came up with is interpolation, that we're interpolated as subjects. And that's the experience of being hailed. Like I think I used the example in class of hailing a taxi cab, right? So that you do this in New York, the taxi driver knows you're hailing them. And the same thing happens to ideologically construct us as subjects. So, someone refers to you in a gendered way, they're hailing you in that gender. You can be hailed in terms of any ideological category, which can be race, age, nationality, language, religion, ability or disability, a whole variety of things, sexual identity and so forth. You can choose not to respond to the hailing or to respond differently, but then there are consequences for that. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So Althusser insists that ideology is not just a set of beliefs about the world, that it actually is material practices within specific institutions that lead to subject formation and to the reproduction of social relations. So basically, the question he asked was, if exploitation is happening in one generation, how does it continue into the next generation? Well, you create ideological subjects that fulfill the same roles as they did in the previous generations. So institutions replace people that fulfill roles within them. And it does this by sort of taking children into institutions and then sorting them into groups and into particular roles. So, children are sorted out by their wealth, by their gender, by their likes and dislikes, and by other things. And then they're kind of shaped into fulfilling different roles in the society. So we'll talk about that more in a little bit when I'm going to get to Balibar and Macherey. Also, ideology is anticipatory. It tells us what we will become. I talked about this in terms of Banks's essay on Bambi, that when he identified the father, stag out on the hill, that he was seeing his own future. And ideology works when we submit freely to the system. And in particular, what freely means there is that it feels good to submit to that system, right? That what Banks felt in that moment when he saw the stag on the hill was the same thing that Bambi felt when he saw his father on the hill, which was, and his mother telling him that that was going to be him one day, was he felt pride, right? So pride is a good, positive feeling. And we tend to feel some pleasure in assuming the roles that have been given to us. If you don't feel pleasure in assuming those roles, then you don't feel free, right? But capitalism and really any ideological system creates an incentive to feel pleasure in adopting or assuming the role. And that's why you feel free, is there's some pleasure with it. And again, under commodity fetishism, you tend to feel pleasure when you're buying stuff, which, well, you get rewarded for being a consumer and playing into the system. So, students, okay, how do we feel free? We feel free because we can reject the interpolating message, yet in doing so, we don't reject the category. The demonstration is the first day of class. I mentioned this before. Students fill up the available desks and face the front of the room. I've rarely seen a class come into a room and students start rearranging the furniture or standing in front of the classroom, or or once the class starts, that they somehow fail to give attention to the teacher, right? That, in other words, all these things were learned over time. And if you didn't learn that over time, or you rebelled against it, you're not going to end up in college, right? Or if you are in college and you're still behaving that way, you're not going to get very far, right? So basically, we sort of assume these things are natural, but they're actually learned. And I'm not saying it's exploitative, right? I'm not saying there's something bad about this. I'm just saying that this is an example of how it happens. It may be necessary, right, to have these divisions between teacher and student, but it's kind of a model for how exploitation can work, because once people start to assume this is my role, this is what I do, you don't do this other thing, then it's fairly easy to exploit people who have already accepted those limits. So again, what I would say is mostly people self-discipline themselves within an ideological system. They don't need a lot of policing. In those places where they do have a lot of policing, like say in, poor urban schools or something, it's because the people in those systems know that it's messed up and it's not acting in their interest, right? So they're rebelling, and then the police come and crush them. That's what happens. So ideology, how does it work in these? Well, you get rewarded for your behavior, as I said. So we're articulated as part of a discursive social system when we're small, before we're capable of employing tools of critical thinking. So you don't really think about it that much when you're a kid, you just do it. Ideology works in the family by gendering us before we're able to reason abstractly about our experiences. And indeed, even before we're born, when parents start getting gifts of clothing or picking out clothing and gendering it based on an ultrasound, or painting the room certain colors and so on and so forth, getting toys that are gender specific. And ideology is pre-reflective, meaning having a critical understanding of ideology doesn't necessarily change the ideology. It's necessary. Althusser is not saying we should do away with ideology. He says ideology is necessary. It's like the software that makes a computer run, the operating software. So you can't live in the world without it. You have to have it. But it's just, you also need to be careful knowing how you were programmed, in a sense, so that maybe you could make some other choices, even if you're running the program. Like I freely admit that I was brought up in a patriarchal system to believe patriarchal heteronormative values and to adopt them. And that is that is the software that's running in my brain all the time. And I have to be aware of it and try to counteract it. I can't totally erase it or undo it. It was put there before I had a choice. So it is also a system of discipline, punishment, and rewards. Reproduction. So this has to do with how societies reproduce themselves. As I mentioned, one generation to the next. How do you end up like 3-4 generations down the line, once everybody else from that previous generation is dead, with the same setup, the same roles, the same systems of exploitation? They may modulate, they may evolve somewhat, but they're very similar. So what Althusser says is we reproduce the conditions of production. So we have to reproduce reproduction, in a sense. And so we're not only reproducing goods and services, but we have to reproduce the people that produce the goods and services. So in other words, the labor, where the labor comes from. And we do that through families and schools and churches and maybe a few other institutions, right? That's the sort of outsourcing. So like the factory isn't reproducing whole society, it's outsourcing the raising of children so that they'll take their place in the factory. That's maybe a good way to put it. So everyone dies, but yet the roles and relationships of exploitation and domination are perpetuated. As I mentioned here, this is mostly outsourced, so businesses don't do it themselves. The labor force has to learn submission and learn the ideology of the ruling class. And importantly, however, each institution is also a site of struggle between the ruling class and oppressed classes. So all those things I said before, there's always struggle going on, even in this, like in the sports world, where there's lots of protesting going on about racist exploitation or gender exploitation, or labor exploitation, right? And you might say, well, those people are highly paid. What do they have to complain about? Well, they're workers too. They might be highly paid, but they're workers too. And there's struggle for various reasons going on in every institution, even in the RSAs, even in the military, even in the police. There are struggles between ruling class forces and oppressed forces in those institutions, because most of the people come from oppressed classes who end up serving in those institutions. So, all right. Reproduction of reproduction. I already started talking about this, but institutions such as family, school, church, and entertainment need to reproduce themselves. Each one does so by sorting people into categories, leaders and followers. So the church has to reproduce clergy and laity. In entertainment, a few people will join the industry and most will be consumers. Families sort children into who is going to receive more resources and privilege, and thus more likely to reproduce the family structure. And school teaches useful knowledge, but also moral things such as rules of good behavior, which means, in quotes, good behavior because it's good behavior in terms of your station in life. How do you behave appropriately in your assigned role? And how do you behave appropriately to those in authority above you? Okay. So as I mentioned, ideology is misunderstood often as just pure ideas or even pure illusion, but it's actually the instruction manual for subject formation by representing social relations and conditions of existence in an imaginary way. So in other words, it gives you a picture of the world and then your place in it. It has a material existence. It is always attached to an institution. There's no ideology outside of institutions. It exists as a set of practices, not ideas, and not primarily ideas. And it's policed in as much as these practices are ritualized. So in other words, you don't just perform masculinity once and then you're good. You have to perform it over and over and over again. That means it's ritualized, right? And so all of the roles we're talking about are ritualized, and then they're policed within their ritualization. So it's a performance, and then you're judged on your performance, right? And if you're not living up to it, you have to be more manly, or you have to be more feminine, or you have to be more competitive, or whatever it is. You have to achieve the values over and over again. Okay. And we do that, we first learn these things through scenes of instruction, which are rituals of inclusion and exclusion around things like race, gender, nationality, etc. You know, this is basically, it plays out all the time in grade school on the playgrounds, right? Where kids may self-segregate in terms of gender, race, and so on, and may police that self-segregation. And anyone who tries to cross over and be in another group is punished. Anyone who doesn't perform according to the values of the group they're in is also punished or put down, right? So that's where, you know, we experience homophobia, sexism, racism, all that kind of stuff on the playground. But it doesn't start on the playground, right? I mean, it's sort of like learned behavior. You learn it from authority figures outside of the playground, and then it comes into the playground. And those are the scene of instruction is your first encounter with those boundaries, right? First encounter of, oh, I'm not allowed to play where the girls are playing, right? I have to play where the boys are playing. That would be a scene of instruction, right? And then every subsequent time would be sort of reinforcing that scene. Okay. Here's an example of coding where You're on a playground, a boy cries, another boy says boys don't cry, and then you have observers witnessing the scene. What happens is both an internal and an external set of events. And we tend to think of these only as external because it's what we see, but the internal is that a series of decisions are going on. So boy number one might be thinking, is boy number two referring to me? Yes or no? Is part of this reasoning girls are inferior? Yes or no? And boys who act like girls, if they're like girls cry, girls are inferior, boys who act like girls are inferior. Then do I respond to boy number two? Yes or no? And obviously it continues. If I respond, how do I respond, right? If I don't respond, what happens? And then there's like, for example, do I get hit? And then do I respond to that? So this scene keeps unfolding, right? With a series of internal decisions and then external actions. So the witnesses have to go through the same sort of coding process of interior decision-making. Even if they're not the boy crying, they still have to decide what it all means. That girls are inferior, that boys who act like girls are inferior, that a response is appropriate, et cetera, et cetera. So each witness goes through that, which means the scene of instruction applies equally to the witnesses as it does to the people directly involved. Why does boy number two do what he does? Well, he knows this scene already. In other words, maybe he was the subject of it, or maybe he witnessed it. And he is rewarded, or he expects to be rewarded by reinforcing the prevailing ideology. In other words, he's marking himself as different from and superior to boy number one. So he gets rewards for that, which is, you know, more power, more affirmation, whatever. So how does literature work? Why are we talking about all this in a literature class? Well, Balabar and Mashere refer to literature as an ideological form, and they argue that the teaching of literature has two functions. The first is to instill nationalism. So in France, which is where they were writing, they said students learn French literature. What's the point of learning French literature? Is to learn what it means to be French. You know, to adopt French culture, French values, French history, and so on, and to see it in contrast to other cultures. So it's not that you don't read British literature, German literature, Spanish literature, you do. But the point, and maybe less of that, but the point is to understand the difference between being French and being those other things, right? And that you clearly identify yourself as French and not, say, British, right? Or not, say, German. So that's instilling nationalism in you. And probably in high school, you had a class on American literature, you know, or maybe it was a literature class, but a lot of the literature was American, right? The point is the same there. The other thing is that they say, and this is really, I think, one of the most interesting things I've read about, you know, Marxist comments on literature, is that students who like literature are tracked as future knowledge workers. And the ones who don't like literature are tracked as future laborers. So in other words, let's say you take a liking in your literature course to the French literature you've been taught. Well, then you're tracked to become a member of the intelligentsia or middle management. In other words, you get to continue in school. And they say literature has no other function. It has no useful function other than that. It doesn't teach you any productive skills. It has no value other than this tracking system. I'm not sure I totally agree with that. And there's lots of people who say literature teaches morals or gives people good character or something. And I don't necessarily believe those things. I would say Balabar and Mashere's argument is the more powerful argument, that literature is taught as a sorting mechanism more than anything else. Now, you know, the fact that I'm bringing this up in a literature class means I would like it not to be used as such, but I don't know any other way around. Like, if you don't like literature, you don't do well in the class. If you don't do well in the class, you don't go forward in college, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's kind of how it works, right? So we'll switch to feminism now. So modern feminism rose from the Enlightenment, really. And you see this play out definitely in the Adams letters, right, between John and Abigail Adams. John is clearly representing Enlightenment values, and those are that men, and it was gendered, had a rational and autonomous will, and if they were possessed of this rational and autonomous will, then they deserve to be free and not under the constraints of a king or of the church. And so, first of all, to say that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, or absolutely false, 100%. If you read the works of the founders, they were very, very clear that in their Enlightenment values that freedom meant freedom from the church, not obedience to it. So they were also clear about separation of church and state. Anyway, just side note there. But so this belief that men were capable, or some men were capable of having a rational and autonomous will, was the foundation of setting up a society where people are supposedly free, right? But there were massive exclusions. So in the United States in the early years, you couldn't vote or participate in public life, meaning in politics, unless you were an adult, white, male who owned property of a certain amount. Like you had to prove that you had like $500 or something where you couldn't participate. And that was a lot of money in those days. So basically, if you were not any of those things, if you were Native American or Black or a woman or a younger person, or you were poor, you couldn't participate in the public system. And the reason was those people didn't have a rational and autonomous will, right? They were irrational and dependent on other people. And so they couldn't be given the freedom to make responsible decisions in a political system because they couldn't think rationally and they weren't autonomous. They were being controlled by someone else. So feminism arose from that and in some ways adopted and said, well, we're just as rational and autonomous as men. You need to extend the franchise. So that was the argument behind the right to vote movement or the suffrage movement, right? That women were, women were at least as rational and autonomous as men, or all men were at least as irrational or as dependent as women, right? But there was also within feminism this other strain that said, maybe rationality and autonomy are not the best measures for determining who should be free or who should have power. And maybe, in fact, they're kind of made up in the first place, and they're not really, they're kind of a mirage to the idea that anyone is really rational or anyone is really autonomous. And we're all dependent in some ways. So that's the kind of relationship with the Enlightenment there. It's both for the Enlightenment and against the Enlightenment, but it really comes up sort of through it. Feminism opposes patriarchy, which is the notion that men should dominate the society, and that clearly is the case in America, where the vast majority of people in power are men, whether we're talking about corporations or the government or any of those institutions we talked about, and that it filters down all the way through society and has impacts on women and non-gender conforming men all throughout the society in every possible way. Feminism seeks gender equality. And the question of what equality is a little complicated. We'll talk about that in a bit. And queer struggles are related. And you may have been following recently some of this discussion on TERFs. I don't know if you've heard this term, but basically the Harry Potter books, forget the author's name, She calls herself a TERF, which is trans exclusionary radical feminist, right? Basically, she's saying, if you're not born a woman, yeah, J.K. Rowling, thank you. If you're not born a woman, you can't be a feminist, and you're not a real woman, and all this kind of stuff. And so there's been a lot of pushback against her and against other people, like now, what's his name, the comedian? I'm terrible with names. Chappelle, Dave Chappelle. But clearly, like, so this question of, does feminism take with it or bring along with it the interest of queer people, trans people, and so on? Now, my own position on this, I'm pretty clear about it, is that feminism isn't really going to succeed unless it's for all people. And it's not going to, in other words, and not only that, but by rejecting queer and trans people, it's setting itself up for exploitation within a patriarchal system, because patriarchy already excludes and exploits queer and trans people. So it's just aligning with patriarchy in that way. So I'm totally against Rowling and Chappelle and what they're doing. I think it's a big either mistake or it's just outright evil. How do American values work? Yes, I also, yeah, we're going to talk about your point that you can't separate identities. So it's saying queer women are invalid. We're going to talk a little bit about intersectionality coming up, which is sort of this complex of how identities work together. So this is sort of like, this graph is the hegemonic categories of the US 1950s style. So, Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best kind of stuff, which is that in each class, there's a preferred, or in each ideological category, there's a preferred term. So you're on the top if you're bourgeois, heterosexual, masculine, Caucasian, Protestant, Anglo-Saxon. And the sign of that, of your success, for example, if you're a bourgeois, the sign of your dominance is through your family, which you show off, your great house and your beautiful kids and your economic success. Heterosexuality is shown off through courtship and marriage. Masculinity is shown off through winning and violence. And there's also competition within femininity to show off beauty and attractiveness. And if you're Caucasian, your values are law and order, punish the transgressors. And Protestant is to have, strong sense of good and evil, right and wrong, etc. And the social value ideal is, if you're bourgeois, you enact this through work and competition, and through heterosexuality, through love, fidelity, monogamy, and so on. And the audience emotion, now this is writing about film, is, with bourgeois, it's ownership and possession. With heterosexuality, it's desire and lust. With masculinity, it's power and aggression, and so on. So hopefully that makes some sense. I'm not going through everything on here, but this is kind of the way we set up dominant values, how they're seen as performed, how they're acted out, and what the feeling is that goes along with that. I forget the theorist who came up with this, but anyway, this is a chart from Greg Ulmer, who borrowed that theorist's work, but he points to what's called the sweet spot of American values. So if you look at the upper right, you see there's these two poles of achievement and nurturing. And we would probably agree that achievement and nurturing can both be good things, and that there's nothing inherently wrong with them. But the sweet spot in the middle is someone who's able to sort of be able to do both, like to be nurturing. So like Bogart in Casablanca, where he's his achievement is he's able to get the transit set up for Ilsa to leave. He's able to kill the Nazi chief who comes. He's able to align the police captain with him. And the nurturing is he sacrifices so that Victor can continue with the war effort and Ilsa can be with him. So he's nurturing and achievement oriented at the same time. And we see that, like, we get all teary eyed when we see that, because it represents the peak of our values. Other examples are like the boxer who plays violin, or the, I don't know, the linebacker who knits or something, but here's the thing. So that green line that bifurcates achievement and nurturing is actually pretty heavily policed, and very heavily gendered, so that women are pushed towards nurturing roles and men are pushed towards achievement roles. And if women try to cross over that line into achievement roles, which we've already agreed, or I've agreed, there's nothing wrong with, they're punished and pushed back. They face obstacles, at least. And the same is true of men who want to take on nurturing roles, is that they're pushed back. So if this was a regular class, I would ask you to shout out the words that you hear for men who try to cross over into nurturing roles. And I would hear it like, what was that you said? Oh, sissy, wuss, gay, fag, girly, And then the roles for women who cross over onto the achievement side, bitch, ball buster, whatever, all those kinds of things, right? Those terms are there to police that line. You can be on the line, but you can't go over it. Now, what's particularly interesting about this, I think, is that 3/4 of the graph shows unhealthy stuff, right? So the bottom right corner is plus nurturing minus achievement. So what's that role? That's the martyr, right? That's the person who sacrifices themselves to be nurturing for others, with no gain for themselves. And women are often pushed into that role, and not only that, but rewarded emotionally for being pushed into that role, told that they're doing a good thing. Men are pushed into the opposite corner, where they have achieved high achievement, but they're doing so at the expense of other people, right? They're not nurturing, but they're taking down or damaging other people or destroying other people. And that's the sort of Gordon Gekko thing, like you're a tough businessman, but you've had to grind people into the dirt and rob other people's livelihoods and destroy your competition and so on, right? And so men are pushed into the upper left corner and women into the bottom right corner, which I think we would both agree both positions are unhealthy. So the only really healthy positions are in the top right. And we push people out of those positions, and we've heavily policed the line between the two. And then Jim Jones is on the bottom left. That's where you destroy yourself and others at the same time. Sort of like suicide cults and so on are along those lines. So again, this is very representative of how gender gets worked out and why the gender values are actually destructive of people. And I would agree, need reform. There should be no punishment of men for wanting to be nurturing, no punishment of women for seeking achievement. Okay, so then within this discussion of gender, there are these sort of two positions, which is essentialism and social constructivism. Essentialism is the belief that our true identity is composed and fixed and unchanging. In other words, you're born female and that's what gives you feminine qualities. And then social constructivism says your identity is actually formed by the culture, not by your birth. So you assume gender because you're brought up in a society that sort of prescripts what gender is and then enforces it and polices it and so on. But it also means to look historically and understand that these concepts are always changing. And I may have mentioned before that in the 19th century, if you were upper class and a boy, you would wear frilly clothes that were pink. And if you were a girl, you would wear more less ornate clothing that was blue, right? And so there's historians of gender who look at things like this and say, well, there was this event that happened at the end of the 19th century called the Great Masculine Renunciation. And the part that what was being renounced among men was ornamentation. In other words, you didn't want to have frills, you didn't want to have jewelry, you didn't want to have big powdered wigs or wear makeup or anything like that. You wanted to wear streamlined functional clothing because masculinity became identified with production, whereas previously masculinity was identified with leisure, right? So if masculinity is identified with leisure, then ornamentation is what you go for. If it's identified with production, then you don't want ornamentation, right? And so we have to understand that gender changes historically, and it's in relation to these other things like economics or other forces. But then you might ask, well, what about David Bowie or Prince or, any number of men, or I guess Lil Nas X or whatever, who perform identity in these very, with a lot of ornamentation or constantly shifting kinds of roles and representations of gender. And the answer is that there's sort of two parts to it. One is that represents kind of a suppressed desire on the part of the culture. That's like what we wish we could do, but are not allowed to do. And so we're attracted to it. And secondly, it is prescribed as having to be necessarily within a certain field, which is entertainment. So that like, if you're an entertainer, you can get away with that. But if you're an electrician, you can't, right? Now, I just mentioned that because I had a friend who was an electrician, a male, who was heterosexual, but he always wore a dress to work. He wore dresses in his daily life, and just, it was obviously a feminine dress. He didn't consider himself trans or gay or any of these other things. He just felt comfortable in a dress. And so he would be in a dress up, on a telephone pole or on a roof or at an electrical plant working as an electrician. And obviously this drew some, commentary, some looks, right? In other words, if he was in a music video, no one would have batted an eye. But being an electrician, it was, problematic. He just didn't give a shit. So he just like, whatever, Anyway, so one way of thinking about this is gender as a performance. Now, Marjorie Garber is a theorist who talked about this and wrote about Hollywood in particular, but she noted that female stars always perform gender. In other words, there's nothing innate or natural about presenting as a female. It is always a performance. And so it always involved the cosmetic body. So her argument was basically that females are always cross-dressing as females, right? It's not possible to just be a female in terms of your representation, because femininity is a performance. And in fact, it's very interesting to look at the way Hollywood and other entertainment industry kinds of things is set up, is that the women in Hollywood roles or in music, a lot of times entertainers, were taught how to be women by men. In other words, it was men who said, this is how you should dress, this is how you should look, this is how you should walk, this is how you should talk, this is your gesture should be like this. So that they were performing femininity at the based on male instructions, right? And then performing it through this thing called the fetish, which could be, hair, makeup, ornamentation, and so on. And anyway, So it's not to say, my argument is not that because it's artificial, it's wrong. That's not, that there's something authentic that's being lost here, right? And that's not what Garber is saying at all. She's just noticing how gender is a performance at its basic. And now masculinity is a performance without ornamentation in the same way. You know, the necktie famously is like the only ornament that survived the masculine renunciation. It's like a signifier of what used to be, of just ornamentation. There's no reason to have a necktie, right? So studies of difference, basically there's different kinds of feminism. This one sort of looks at our male and females. Do they communicate differently? Primarily, like, is male writing different from female writing? If so, is it better or worse than female writing? There's a lot of division on this. Some say, like, well, males communicate more directly and that's better, and that women should learn how to communicate in that way, and that will make women stronger. Some say, no, the way women communicate is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. In some ways, it's better to the way men communicate because it's, there's been a lot of study on what's called phatic communication, P-H-A-T-I-C, which is communication that basically communicates that I'm listening, I'm with you, right? And so men often are accused of being bad listeners and not showing a lot of phatic communication. So phatic communication is like, you can fake it, right? But it's basically like, yeah, oh yeah, definitely, for sure. Oh, I know what you mean. You know, that's phatic communication, where you're basically communicating that the line is open and I hear you and I take you seriously and I respect you, right? So that argument is that it's of equal or even higher value because phatic communication is valuable. Then studies of power have to do with intersectionality. In other words, all those sort of divisions of identity I talked about before. So you could be, say, a native, queer, trans person who is poor and blah, blah, blah. And so, like, you're not just affected by one identity, but by all of your identities. And they're intersectional in the sense that at any given moment in any given interaction, you might have to engage someone over one or more of your identity categories. So we're not just one thing, right? We're all these different things. Crucial to kind of the discussion of the Adams letters. Yeah, that's okay. We can check out. I know we got 2 minutes left, but public and private sphere. So the public sphere was one in which the men participated. So this is what John Adams is doing, is participating in politics. And the private sphere is basically the domestic sphere, which is like, you take care of the house, right? So the argument was women should be in the public sphere as well as the domestic sphere, not trapped in one sphere. Studies of female experience have to do with moving away from the Enlightenment and the notion that there is a universal way of understanding the world, right? That there's, like, we can talk about universalities based on some universal truth and some abstractions, right? And that instead this is not the opposite of truth. It's saying that we have to write from our embodied positions, meaning I write from my position of intersectionality, from my experience in the world. It's absolutely true. It's just not universal, right? So studies of female experience look at that, how people are shaped in their particulars rather than looking for universal truths. And look at that. I finished with 1 minute to spare. Okay. Any questions, comments? Good, useful, terrible? You disagree? You're throwing tomatoes?